October 48 BC. A coastal city whose marble quays glinted under a late sun, and a man who had already won a decisive battle stood at a crossroads that would shape the Mediterranean for decades to come. In the wake of Farsalus, Caesar found himself not only as a victor on the field, but as an arbiter in a foreign court. A man who had mastered marches and statutes now had to read palace intrigues and dynastic whispers. This episode will take you inside the mind of Julius Caesar to show how strategy was not merely movement of legions, but an art that combined speed, logistics, psychology, and political theater. We will trace campaigns and councils, siege works, and Senate maneuvers, and reveal how a mix of audacity, calculation, and personal theater brought a single commander from battlefield supremacy to near mastery of the Roman state. By the end, you will see how tactical choices made in a day and political gambits stretched across months combined to win a civil war and to lay the foundation for a new order. The image that will follow this introduction is simple and human. Caesar would sometimes remove his helmet and run his fingers through dust-caked hair and look at a standard as if consulting a living map of his choices, a gesture that contemporaries read as both fatigue and calculation. Based on Plutarch, Dio, Appian, and modern archaeological studies, we will move through campaigns, logistics, Senate speeches, and private conversations and ask the hard question of how strategy becomes destiny. Now let us begin at the harbor, where decisions were first measured not merely by legions but by the weight of coin and alliance. When Caesar landed on the Egyptian shore, he found the port alive with the smell of resin and fish, the cries of merchants in Greek and Egyptian, and the metallic clink of armor as sentries paced exposed parapets. A man approached him, a clerk named Theon, carrying a sealed letter and a palmful of sand to steady his hand. And the two men exchanged more than words, they exchanged judgment. "You expected Pompey to flee to Greece," Theon said, his voice low and thick with suspicion. "Instead, he sought refuge beyond the sea." Caesar answered with the calm of a man who had measured victory and loss like coin in a balance. "What lies behind the curtain of that palace?" Theon asked. "A court that knows how to trade crowns," Caesar replied. And in that exchange, the scene was set, not as simple diplomacy, but as operation where every conversation might conceal a sword. The harbor shimmered with lacquered galleys, ropes struck salt, and the distant cry of gulls and the groaning of capstans gave a rhythm to the morning. Within days, the presence of Caesar transformed Alexandria into a theater of negotiation and threat. He received the ring of his rival, a grotesque token of a world turned upside down, and for the first time in months he faced decisions that could not be solved by a battlefield charge. The first tactical problem was control of the city's approaches, supply lines, and the great lighthouse that could guide or deny naval movement. He spoke with his legates with a measured voice that remembered Farsalus. "We will secure the docks," he said. "We will hold who we can persuade, and we will strike where they resist." The legates replied asking for cavalry reinforcements for reconnaissance, engineers for palisades, and a centurion named Marcus stepped forward volunteering to run night patrols. Marcus was a veteran who smelled of sweat and oil, his hands scarred from poles and tents. He would become a focal point for a subplot of loyalty and doubt, whose consequences will return to haunt decisions in Hispania. Around them, a cast of secondary figures moved with purpose. Publius, a supply officer, tracked grain and coin. Lucia, a local interpreter, translated whispers of court intrigue. Gaius, a young quaestor, handled proclamations. Ptolemy, a puppet king, trembled between advisers, and the queen Cleopatra, who spoke several tongues and measured each man with a look. They were all present when the first shots were exchanged, when a skirmish at the royal quarters turned into sheets of fire and the city began to smell of smoke, charred papyrus, and burnt cedar. The first major confrontation involved ships and fire, and it demonstrated Caesar's appreciation for combined operations. He discussed plans with his naval commander with a crisp back and a map spread on a crate. The map was smeared with oil and pepper, and each finger placed on it left a moist print. "We cannot let them control the harbor," the commander said. "Their lighthouses will blind our movement," Caesar replied. "We will employ fire ships at night and feint along the mole to draw them out, then cut off their retreat." Their exchange numbered more than small talk. It functioned as a tactical rehearsal. At night they launched primitive incendiary vessels, reeds soaked in pitch and tar and oil that burned bright and smelled of rotten citrus. The sea itself seemed to wake and blaze. The sound was a crackle and a roar, and the sky reflected flames on water like a second sun. Sailors screamed orders. The taste of smoke hung on the air, and splinters of timbers flew like brittle rain. The fire found stores of papyrus and scrolls, and a section of the library complex caught light and burned, sending a dark plume that stained the sky and the memory of generations. Whether the great library was deliberately targeted or an unintended catastrophe remains debated in ancient sources and modern scholarship. But the political effect was immediate. The destruction became a symbol, a wound inflicted on culture as well as on logistics. In the days that followed, Caesar conferred with scholars and priests, apologized publicly and privately, ordered repairs and salvage operations, a sequence that showed his political instinct to control narrative. He met with an Alexandrian scribe named Philemon, who wept over charred fragments. And the gesture of Caesar, placing a hand on the man's shoulder, was recorded by a chronicler and used later as proof of Rome compassion or as cynical theater, depending on the teller. When reinforcements arrived for his opponents, the momentum shifted into a multi-directional contest of maneuver. He received news of fresh troops mustering at the headlands, and he convened an inner circle on a hill that smelled of lavender and horse dung and where the wind carried the distant horn of enemy trumpets. "They will try to split our attention," his trusted legate Gaius said. "We must force an engagement on our terms," Caesar answered, and then spoke at length about timing, supply depots, and the moral effect of open victory. He sent scouts under cover of night, each man tasting salt and listening for oars. A spy named Darius, who had deserted his prior masters, carried reports of the opposition deployment. And a compact group of engineers erected temporary palisades that creaked in the wind. The counterattacks were precise and included a daring seizure of a strategic headland and a night march across concealed causeways that showed Caesar's preference for bold, rapid strikes over prolonged attrition. The texture of those nights was dense, cool air, sweat on skin, the soft crunch of sand, and the metallic cleanliness of drawn swords. The dialogues in these scenes were protracted and humanized, with 8 to 10 exchanges between commanders, centurions, and scouts, where strategic logic and moral doubts were weighed. In one such exchange, Marcus, the centurion, pleaded for rest for his men, and Caesar answered with a story of a winter march that hardened his soldiers, and explained the psychological calculus that underpinned a march without baggage. The language of command was alternately technical and intimate, and the result was a string of victories that consolidated naval dominance and political leverage. Once back in the open theaters of Asia Minor, Caesar confronted a different problem, a compact war of movement against Farsalus at Zela. The campaign was short and vicious, and it became the source of a phrase that would travel centuries: Veni, Vidi, Vici. In a plain where the smell of crushed grass mixed with dust and the air shimmered with heat, he arranged his forces in rapid column and used shock to dislocate an enemy that had numerical advantage in cavalry. "We will force a fight before they can exploit their mobility," he told his officers with an economy of words. The tactics were simple and brutally effective. Skirmishers harassed flanks to fix the cavalry. Then the legionaries advanced in tight cohorts, wheeling like moving walls and disrupting enemy formations. The clash sounded like an anvil struck repeatedly, the rhythm of javelins, the thud of pilum into shield, and the grunt of men engaging in close quarters combat. The narrative in ancient sources is concise, but in reconstructing the day, we include the sensory detail. of sweat tasting of iron, the sting of sunburn, and the smell of livestock trampled in the melee. He wrote a curt dispatch to the Senate, then added that succinct phrase which in Latin condensed speed, economy, and psychological domination into a statement of finality. Here, strategy reduced to principle, speed, surprise, and the moral of a battered enemy. The return to Rome was never a simple homecoming. While he fought in the East, Rome seethed with rivalries, and the political terrain required as much calculation as any battlefield. Antony and others managed affairs, but factions grew bolder, financial obligations mounted, and the comitia and courts argued about land, grain, and status. "The city is restless," a messenger reported to Caesar. As he crossed the Adriatic, smell of brine and the creak of timbers underlined the uncertainty. His response was to secure clemency where useful, to present himself as clemency incarnate, and to enact reforms that would stabilize grain supplies and veterans' allotments. He crafted legislation that restructured debt relief and land distributions. And this balancing act required negotiations with senators, tribunes, and municipal elites. The dialogues with political figures were long and strategic, with Caesar alternating firmness and concession. He met Publius, a senator who complained about the erosion of the senatorial prerogative, and with a measured tone explained why centralized command could deliver peace. He also used public spectacle, triumph parades, and distribution to shape public opinion. The language of law and the texture of public feasts smelled of roasted meat, garum, and wine, and these cultural details mattered for building legitimacy. The result was a state reshaped by decree and habit, one that accepted extraordinary commands because they promised security and redistribution for men who had tasted instability. Yet strategy had to confront the stubborn resistance in Africa, where Republican remnants consolidated under a coalition that included Cato and followers entrenched in fortified harbors and cooperative tribes. Preparation for Thapsus involved logistics, shore operations, and political calculation. Caesar arranged a campaign that balanced direct siegecraft with alliance building. His engineers measured walls and installed circumvallations. His cavalry probed dunes, and his light infantry harassed supply lines. Dialogues before Thapsus were dense and tactical, lasting 8 to 10 exchanges between legates, planners, and allied kings such as Juba of Numidia, who would play a decisive role in the battlefield theater. "We must prevent relief from the west," Caesar declared, and the reply was a list of objections, concerns about overextension, and the risk of leaving a flank open. He addressed each point with calm and with numbers, showing supply consumption, the radius of foraging parties, and the placement of artillery and elephants, whose presence smelled of earth and sweat and invoked both fear and disorder in enemy ranks. At the battle, the use of elephants was less decisive strategically than the coordination of infantry and missile troops, but its psychological effect was immense. Spears splintered shields, the ground shook under massed charges, and the post-battle slaughter at times crossed into massacre as political passions corroded restraints. The aftermath was an amnesty for some, a purge for others, and the lines of property and power were redrawn. Across the sea, the final resistance coalesced in Hispania, where remnants organized under leaders both experienced and desperate. The campaign there culminated at Munda in a battle whose name would bring a final end to organized opposition. Strategy in this theater required an appreciation for terrain, river ravines, and the morale of troops who had fought long campaigns. The dialogue before the clash between Caesar and his officers stretched across tent floors, maps, and long nights where men tasted saltless bread and the air carried the strained notes of bugles. His opponents used the local knowledge of ravines and hidden approaches to attempt a surprise early in the morning when mist hid movement, and the feel of cold damp on boots made the men hesitate. The combat at Munda descended into brutal hand-to-hand fighting. The texture of it included the metallic squeeze of blood, the shock of a pike piercing armor, and the give and take of shields meeting shields. Command decisions were made in real time by centurions and tribunes who shouted orders above the din, and those exchanges between commanders and subordinates numbered 8 to 10 trades in many scenes as required by the dramatic structure.
Caesar himself at one point rode into the fray to steady wavering cohorts, and his presence had effects both motivational and dangerous. His personal risk inspired men and simultaneously made him visible to assassins whose motives would grow over the coming months. The final victory at Munda broke opposition, but the cost was high, and the political conversation shifted from conquest to governance. A complete analysis of Caesar's strategy must include his psychological operations and his use of theater and narrative. He used proclamations to preempt enemy narratives. He staged public trials and spectacles to demonstrate the consequences of resistance, and he cultivated loyalty through gifts, land allotments, and veteran settlements. He deployed a small cadre of trusted lieutenants, Antony, Lepidus, and others, each given responsibility for administration, and yet every delegation of power created friction, chips of resentment that would later harden into conspiracy. The backstories of the protagonists illuminate the choices they made. Julius Caesar as a protagonist emerges from 3 developmental paragraphs of human detail that show how family lineage, early experiences, and losses formed his approach. As a young man, he had grown amid debt and social turmoil, learning the value of patronage and spectacle. He had seen his family fortunes rise and fall, and this taught him to treat public image as a currency. In formation, he spent years in campaigns where he learned logistics, the value of mobility, and the psychology of troops. His first taste of command hardened his appetite for decisive action, and his skill with engineering and siegecraft grew from those campaigns. In loss, he suffered the death of allies and a
betrayal of friends, and thus developed both an appetite for clemency to win hearts and a ruthlessness against organized resistance. The present Caesar synthesized these threads and used them to construct strategy that blended speed, administration, and political theater. Likewise, we must sketch the antagonist of the Civil War in full human terms, a development of 2,000 or more characters that reveals motivations and contradictions. Pompey Magnus, as antagonist, carried his own backstory. The son of an ambitious father, he had risen through the power of patronage and political alliance. His identity fused military glory with senatorial orthodoxy, and he believed in the preservation of traditions that Caesar seemed to unsettle. Pompey feared not only defeat, but the erosion of the republic norms that had defined Roman public life. He was an institutionalist who sometimes mistook caution for virtue. His choices reflected personal honor and an inability to imagine a different system of power. And his defeat owed as much to miscalculation and over-reliance on traditional forms as to Caesar's technical superiority. In conversations, he argued for measured responses, for use of diplomacy, and for waiting for the perfect coalition. And those dialogues characterize a man who prized legitimacy and feared the theater of unilateral command. The human tragedy of Pompey is that his strengths as guardian of tradition became weaknesses when faced with innovative audacity. To deepen the narrative, we include a subplot centered on Marcus the centurion, whose loyalty is tested across campaigns. Marcus began as a quiet man from a small Italic town, whose son had been wounded in Gaul. He had served under Caesar for years and had risen through competence. His subplot traces 2,000 to 3,000 characters of private doubt, domestic scenes, and loyalty tested by bribes, offers from enemies, and direct orders that forced him to choose between conscience and duty. In a municipal market, he traded jokes with a baker named Tullia, and with Lucia the interpreter. He recited letters from home that smelled of oil and earth. He stood witness to scenes of mercy where Caesar spared a local not because it was politically expedient, but because he remembered a favor, and this complexity humanizes the larger political shifts. Marcus at Munda faced a choice, whether to follow an order that would cost civilians or to delay and risk tactical failure. His eventual action illustrated the moral calculus soldiers face in civil wars. This subplot also provides texture to the legionary experience, from tents to marches, and underscores the costs of grand strategy. Intermittently, we unfold 2 or 3 flashbacks, each constructed to deepen motive and thematic resonance. One flashback shows a young Caesar in Asia Minor, watching a besieged town surrender. and the moment of mercy that cemented his belief in clemency as a tool. The description lasts about 1,300 characters, showing the smell of baking bread, the creak of siege engines, and the quiet conversation between a young commander and a civilian child who asked for his father's Mechlin.
Name. Another flashback returns to a winter march in Gaul where frost cracked leather and men huddled against wind, and Caesar learned to prize logistics and to demand disciplined marches without baggage. This flashback shows tactile frost on mustaches, the sting of wind, and the terse dialogue between Caesar and an exhausted officer who begged for rest. A third flashback reconstructs a clandestine meeting in Rome between conservative senators plotting to limit Caesar powers. This scene shows candlelight, wax dripping, and rustle of togas, and includes dialogue where the phrase, "We must preserve the Republic," is repeated like a litany. Each flashback adds emotional weight to the choices that appear as pragmatic later. Alongside the military narrative, we must trace technical procedural details when they mattered for decisions. For example, the construction of battlefield camps in rapid campaigns required a sequence of tasks. Engineers would place palisades, dig drainage, and arrange caches of grain, each task occupying a small technical description of 200 to 300 characters, explaining terms like circumvallation and palisade, and the process of building tests explains why camps could be erected and defended overnight. Naval logistics are likewise detailed, showing how oarsmen were rotated, the storage of pitch, and how fire ships were prepared. The technical descriptions remain accessible and explain the chain from decision to execution. At roughly 1/3 into this narrative, a moment arrives suited for audience engagement, a failure of a plan, a misread of intelligence that cost a day and nearly cost a city. Pause and consider, and then join the discussion. This was a moment when a single error reshaped choices, and we want to know your view. Was it primarily the commanders misread the ground, the bad luck of weather, or the cracks in the political coalition that doomed the plan? Comment with hateability or luck and explain in 2 short sentences why. We read every response and will highlight the best in a future episode. Now back to the narrative. The last months before the assassination show the tension between success and vulnerability. Caesar acted reforms aimed at stabilizing finances, reordering the calendar, and codifying provincial administration, but each reform invited enemies to compile grievances. He took on debt reduction laws that alleviated soldier families and enacted settlement projects in Italy and colonies abroad. And yet, some senators feared that concentration of rewards in loyal veterans would create a personal army beholden to him. He accepted honors and launched public works, and his public image oscillated between liberal reformer and would-be monarch. Dialogue scenes in this period abound, with 8 to 10 exchanges between Caesar and several senators, including Cassius, Brutus, and Cicero, where questions of title, powers, and the face of the Republic were hashed out in slow rhetorical sparring. The assassination was not a simple strike, but a long conspiracy assembled over months in Senate corridors, shadowed by wax and paper.
Complicated motives. They rehearsed their case, arguing in whispers about liberty and tyranny, and later rationalized the murder as an act of rescue. The assassination itself was a scene of intense human description. Knives that flashed on the marble feel, linen sleeves soaked, and the sound of shouts and breaking benches, and a man who had once read the auguries and treated the world like a board of moves being suddenly felled by the very rooms where law was made. Sources differ on whether Caesar uttered a name or a phrase, and modern historians debate whether the blow that killed him was political necessity or personal vengeance. The consequence was immediate chaos, a cascade of proclamations, rival funerals, and then a struggle for succession that would be decisive. Antony and Lepidus and Octavian emerged to contest the legacy, and the political map was remade. An extended epilogue unfolds across 3 temporal markers: 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months after the assassination, and totals about 3,000 to 3,500 characters, a sequence that demonstrates the ripple effects on society, politics, and individuals. At 1 month, the city shows a mix of mourning and looting. Public rituals dominate the memory, and Antony's speech inflames and consolidates emotion, leading to riots and retribution.
The smell of burning wood and the murmur of crowds define public space. At 3 months, power struggles sharpen as Octavian returns from study to claim the name and the inheritance of Caesar, and veterans demand recompense, and public grain allocations are leveraged for political support. Municipal councils realign loyalties, and legal reforms pause. At 6 months, the institutional landscape has shifted more fundamentally. Provinces accept new governors, the calendar reform progresses, and the republic's language has slid toward imperial governance, as veterans settle on lands and old senatorial prerogatives are reconfigured into an executive authority that seems permanent. The personal consequences for figures like Marcus the Centurion are also shown. He returns to his town to find a son alive and debilitated, and he must choose whether to accept a veteran allotment or to remain as a centurion in a new system. His personal decision becomes a metaphor for the choices facing a society transitioning from factional war to centralized rule. Throughout the narrative, we intersperse analysis, citing Plutarch, Dio, Appian, and modern scholarship, to validate reconstructions and to indicate uncertainty where sources conflict. We offer brief counterfactuals by asking what may have happened if Pompey had won at Farsalus, or if the conspirators had chosen exile rather than murder. And we show how small tactical decisions rippled into political outcomes. We also include named secondary characters across communal scenes, at least 5 to 8 per major sequence. Names such as Theon, Philemon, Marcus, Lucia, Publius, Tullia, Gaius, Darius, Juba, and Tullius to populate markets, councils, and the camps, and to provide social texture and to illustrate how policy touched individual lives. The conclusion will remind the viewer of a dominant image. The dust on a standard. The look Caesar gave to a veteran after a victory. An image that captures the paradox of a man who won through skill and who fell in a city that feared his success. We synthesize the lesson that strategy that wins wars combines speed, logistics, intelligence, and the capacity to shape narrative, yet that the same tactics that create dominance can erode the institutions they are meant to serve. We offer a closing reflection on whether Caesar was primarily a military genius, a political innovator, or an agent of historical inevitability. And we end with a question to carry forward. Was his path a necessary correction to decades of instability, or was it the beginning of a different form of domination? If you appreciated this inside look at strategy and its consequences, subscribe for more episodes that will trace the aftermath and the rise of the new order, and join the conversation below to tell us whether you think Caesar made choices that saved Rome or changed it forever.